Nova New Dawn is a expansion that I'm working on for next year, for 2023, for Nova, as its name implies. It is kind of a multi-part thing. I've talked about it on previous streams, but in case this is the first time you're learning about it, it's going to be a supplement that helps you make maps, kind of like, but better than the map that's on the screen right now, for the world that your Nova campaign might take place in. And then also is going to have rules for helping more robust like mission generation stuff and like support for campaign play. That's kind of what I'm going for with New Dawn, is to because I've always talked about and mostly played Nova as a one-shot, so it'll be nice to actually kind of put some support out there for campaign stuff. And then it also then, to follow that idea, will have a faction turn component built into it, because I love faction turns. I think they're really cool. So that's the goal. That's the plan broadly of New Dawn. Hey Kazrak, good to see you. I'm glad you could catch a stream too. So, this is from like old streams before where I was kind of messing around with things. I'm just keeping it here because we're gonna need something kind of like this in a little bit, but we'll come back to this in a second. So my goal for today is to basically play through a component of New Dawn. So my plan here is to sort of record myself playing parts of New Dawn as I play it, or as I develop it, to see if this stuff makes sense, what fits, what doesn't fit. So it's going to be sort of like live design and playtesting at the same time. So this stuff that I've all got on the screen is stuff that I wrote a couple days ago, and now I have a chance to actually sit down and go through it. So today we are just working on the map building component of New Dawn. So like I said, it's got map building, mission generation stuff, faction turn stuff, things like that. And today we're just building the map. And so this idea of like map building is going to be something that you do a lot in the beginning of your New Dawn campaign, and then you do like a little bit more as you go through the campaign, as you add more components to the map. So before I go through and start doing this stuff, I want to again go back to this map that I had on the screen before. So this is like broadly what I imagine a map in Nova would look like in a campaign. You've got your central city where your Sparks kind of, it's their hub, right? It's where you all play from. There's like story prompts and stuff like that in the book that help you like explore this concept. So you've got your central city. And then there's the dusk around it, which is just the nightmarish world outside. And so the question is, what is out there? And there are rules in the book for generating missions, and you can follow those rules and kind of just do a bunch of one-off things and put together locations and structures, and it works. But I wanted your world to feel a little bit more grounded by having set locations and stuff like that. So we're going to have what we're calling sectors, so not segments, but sectors, that are going to be placed around the map. When you start your Nova campaign, you'll place a certain number of these sectors around, and then as your players are moving around the map, as they've started to maybe learn a little bit more about the world, they will start building connections between segments so that they can move from one to the next. They'll start exploring and finding new segments. These segments will be filled with locations. They're filled with locations and things to do, places to go, enemies present, resources, which will be sort of a component of the faction turn, I think. So I figured let's just try this thing. Let's actually do it and make some segments and see how the process feels. See what works, see what doesn't work. Find the pain points and then go from there. So I've got our map here. We'll use this as like our starting map, and then we'll kind of go from there. But we've got a starting segment or a sector and everything like that, and we'll we'll come back to this map as we start to paint it a little bit more. All right, so here's the process. Right now, rules as written in December of 2022 for building your map is to roll for your initial number of sectors and then go through for each sector a number of steps that create the components that are inside of it. So the very first thing you want to do is figure out how many sectors are going to go on your map in the first place. You can choose, or you can roll if you just prefer to roll, right? So you can see that largely my idea is that you don't have lots and lots of sectors to begin with, right? You're likely going to have just one or two places that your city is aware of, like known zones of the dusk. Now, a sector is not just like a single place that has just like a building in it. A sector has lots of things in it. It'll have like one or two buildings. It'll have notable things. There'll be enemy factions present. So when we say sector, we're not saying like a mission location. It's a place that could house multiple missions inside of it. So if you end up with just one sector to start with, it's not the worst thing in the world, because you can now go and do a couple missions there, go to familiar ground, and then you'll start to explore and add more sectors to your map. I'm going to start by just building 2 sectors tonight. I'm going to just build 2 sectors and just see how that feels, and we'll go from there. So we've got 2 sectors that we're going to be starting with. So I've got my playtest over here. We've got the number of sectors is 2. A little bigger. A little bigger for my aging eyes here. All right, so we've got 2 initial sectors, and now we're going to go through and build the sectors. So we'll call this first one the Clover sector. All right, Clover sector. And now we go through the steps of building a sector. First thing you do is determine what zone it is in. So if you're not familiar with Nova, the Dusk is the kind of the cruel, warped world outside of your cities. It's broadly categorized into 3 zones: the Crimson, the Dusk, and the Umbral. Crimson is basically everything that is kind of immediately around the cities. You can probably still get some of like the glow from the sun wells in the cities that are lighting up this area. It's canonically kind of where the Hellions typically are located, most typically, but anything could be in the Crimson. You go further out, the Dusk is the second zone. That makes up the majority of the space in the world, is the Dusk. The Umbral is the stuff that's very far out there, far away from the cities, far removed from everything, and that's where things are like especially weird and everything like that. Now, you'll notice that when you determine the sector that or zone a sector is in, depends on how you're adding it to the map. So if it's a starting sector, this is the spread. If you're adding a new sector, it's actually based off of where you're leaving from, like what zone you're attaching to. So for example, the starting sectors, which is what we're working on tonight, 1 through 3. So 50% of the time it's going to be Crimson. Again, that kind of makes sense that we typically are going to map out the stuff closest to the city, some stuff out in the Dusk, and it's very rare that our starting sector would be all the way out in the Umbral. The reason this is important is a couple of reasons. One, from a mission generation perspective, both in the book and what will be in New Dawn, the further you are away from the city, the more dangerous missions are. So just generally speaking, if you only have one starting sector and it's in the Umbral, your sparks are off. They're gonna have a hell of a fight in front of them. 2 is this is related to the faction turn stuff as well. So the factions all vying for control of the sectors, the resources inside it, and stuff like that. Some factions are more present in certain parts of the Dusk, and so that's just something to keep in mind. Why the spread is important. If we were adding a new sector to the map through exploration or like world building, which is going to be its own section, it's actually based off of where you currently are. I'm not going to go too deep into this because we're not really doing it, but basically either the next place that you're adding is in the same zone as you're in right now, so kind of going back to our map. I'll just say it's in the same zone, it's further from the city, or it's closer to the city. And if we just go back to our map real quick, our old map, like the one that I had worked on before, you can see that like These zones are probably in the same, right? This is a further zone away. So this is how you would find new places, right? If we were in the Eclipse sector and we rolled the outcome that is further away from the city, we would add a sector out here, out into the Umbral. If we kind of consider this the Dusk. So that's how sectors get added. So let's figure out what our Clover Zone is. So the Clover Sector Zone, I'm going to roll based off of the table up top, is a 5. So it's in the Dusk. So it is in the Dusk Zone, which we're not going to go too deep into this stuff today because today's just building the map. But in future stuff, that would be really important if we did like mission generation. So like in future streams when I'm testing mission generation or faction turn stuff, this being in the Dusk will be relevant and important. Okay, so that's the first thing that we do. Great. Now we're moving on to the theme. Themes are something that are in Nova, in the rulebook itself. I should say that the stuff that we're talking about today is an adaptation and expansion on the stuff that Jeremy Gage did for the Nova book. So Jeremy put together like the mission generation structure for Nova with like the locations and the structures and themes and stuff like that. And I want to kind of add to that stuff. I want to kind of codify it a little bit more than the abstract stuff that's in the book. So we're still keeping a lot of the concepts that you find in the rulebook of Nova, but we're just adding on to them. So the theme is something that you will determine. Now, I'll talk about in a second here what these themes do specifically, but let's just figure out, like, here's our 6 themes. Let's figure out what kind of theme Clover Sector is. It is a 6, which means it's a grotesque it's a grotesque theme. So what does the theme actually do? The theme in the book is just there to give you some like prompting words that you can use to respond to players in certain scenarios. But now the theme is going to have a much more mechanical impact on missions and on factions and everything like that. So it will, to show you, I'll just kind of give you an example of some of the stuff that I've been working on for themes. So none of this stuff is set in stone. This is all still early on, but like, here's our themes. And generally speaking, I want a theme to have 3 effects. The enemy faction that's present, if it has a preferred enemy faction, the sector effect, so this is a macro level effect that it has, so this will affect missions, this will affect faction turn, this will affect like travel and stuff like that. And then the mission effect is like literally the stuff that will happen when you're playing Nova, what is going to happen. So for example, right, here is the Pale theme. So the Pale theme, the Lunar Cult is going to be the preferred thing. So if we had rolled Pale, the Lunar Cult would have been the faction assigned to this sector. I haven't come up with a sector effect for it yet, but I have a general idea that the mission effect, so the mechanical micro effect in Nova, is going to be something like supernovas are less effective, permanent death is on the line. That's because a Pale themed zone is warped by the moon. The sun's effects are certainly less powerful. You've got lunar cult magics going on, and so your spark technology doesn't work the way that you're used to it working. We rolled grotesque, which means I don't have a specific enemy faction in mind, so there will be a step later on that we will kind of randomly determine the faction. The sector effect, broadly speaking, again, none of this is mechanically defined just yet, but generally speaking, this is going to be a sector that is harder to map, explore, and travel through. This is a nightmare space. It's not a fun space for the Sparks to be in. The mission effects are, generally speaking, that the health and fuel are going to be capped lower than what the Sparks actually are. So being in the grotesque sector is hard work. So it's just good for us to know that when you're in Clover Sector, you're in for a real rough time while you are here. Okay, so we've got our sector. We have the zone that it's in. We have the theme. We determine the enemy presence next. Now, some sectors, like I said, already have an enemy faction predetermined. The grotesque one doesn't, which means we're going to roll for it to see who is going to be in this sector. So you can see 1 through 4 are each of our 4 factions. 5 and 6 means that there's 2 factions, and you're just going to roll twice to see who they are. Rolled a 3, which means the Corvus are here. So this is the enemy faction is the Corvus. A thing to note about enemy factions in sectors is, especially when we're doing the initial map building, this is just the starting enemy faction that is here. It doesn't mean that no other enemies are ever going to be here. It doesn't even mean that the Corvus are always going to be here. That's what the role of the faction turn is going to be, is that it's going to move things around. That enemy factions are going to be moving units around. They're going to be vying for these sectors, and the Sparks will have an influence as well. If the Sparks come to this sector and just wipe out the Corvus are no longer the faction present, and a new faction would move in. So it's just important to note that the stuff that we're doing now is just sort of like initial painting of the map, but the map is never inked. It's actually more, rather than painting, it's penciling everything in so that we can change it with time as the campaign plays on. Okay, so we got a Corvus faction in a grotesque sector in the dusk. The next thing is to determine the points of interest. Now, this is something that I'm still writing, so I don't have all of the possible points of interest in mind in terms of like what they are or mechanically what they do. But what is a point of interest? A point of interest on our map is, these are locations. These are the places that the missions would take place in. These are places where like notable fights are going to happen. So if your Sparks are on the way to another sector, so like let's say for example, our Sparks are on their way to the Eclipse sector, and they go through the Clover sector, and I'm playing as the GM and I want to throw a fight their way before they make it to the Eclipse sector where their mission is, I might look at the points of interest that are in the Clover segment or sector and go, oh, there's this cool landmark here. I'm going to have them have a fight here, or something is going to happen here, right? So these are places that the GM can call upon to center missions around, to center objectives around, to center random things around. But these are now the known locations within the segment, the important locations. Hence, point of interest. This is the starting number of points of interest, or POIs, in a sector. Again, this will change with time. You know, if you show up at a factory and then you blow it up, that factory is no longer a POI, right? But you might, through exploration, discover more things. And this exploration thing that I keep talking about, it's not something we're going to do today. It'll be a playtest in the future. But part of the faction turn is the players deciding what do they want to do with the map. Do they want to map out more of the map? Do they want to learn more about specific places? Do they want to extract resources from the map? Do they want to go fight enemies by sending city forces against the enemy factions? All this is stuff that they can do, and one of those things then is that exploration thing. And that's the opportunity to add more sectors, to add more points of interest to sectors and things like that. So this is just the initial set of POIs in the Clover sector. So let's roll. As you can see, largely it's going to be one or two of them to start in a place. We rolled 6 though, so there are 3 points of interest. There are 3. So let's figure out what these points of interest are. The next thing that we do is we determine if the points of interest is one of 2 things, a structure or a landmark. You'll also notice that this step in the process is the most detailed. It has the most things going on in it, is determining points of interest, because this is where your players are going to probably be spending the most time when they're actually playing Nova. So we want to have a pretty good sense of what this stuff is. So next thing, when you start with the POI, is determine its category. There's 2 categories, structures and landmarks. Structures, those are man-made things, right? Those are going to be bases, factories, sunwells, things like that. Landmarks, that's going to be more natural environments. Those are going to be noticeable locales in the environment and things like that. You'll notice that the breakdown of landmark versus structure changes depending on which zone we're in. So when you're in the Crimson, it's still largely close to the cities, which means there's going to be a lot of structures around. But the further you go out, the more landmarks there are going to be and fewer structures there are. So we are in the dusk. So the first thing that we need to do is determine the category of our first our first POI, which is going to be in the dusk. So it's a 50-50 shot on it being landmark or structure. It is going to be a landmark. So some sort of natural environment here. I've got an idea about doing something with anomalies, but since I haven't written it out, we're not really going to do anything with it. Next, we can either choose the type of landmark we want it to be or roll on this thing. I'm going to just roll because that just seems more fun to me. So we've got craters, rock formations, cave system, overgrown flora, predator lair, and an actual sun shard out there. So let's see what our thing is. It's a 5. It's a predator's lair, which is kind of cool. So we have some sort of like the haze dwellers, right? The beasts of the dusk. One of them has created a nest here, a hunting ground here of some kind. This is a notable location within the Clover sector. So I haven't written out any ideas about what this stuff is going to be, but just to give you like a preview, I have generally this idea that like I think these POIs are going to provide a resource of some kind, which is going to be related to like base building and faction turn stuff, a sector effect, so again a macro effect, and a mission effect, so some sort of like specific effect during missions. As you can see, I haven't written any of this stuff out, so mechanically we don't know what a predator layer is. I haven't even started the landmarks, but we just know that there's a predator layer here, and if the sparks ever go into the Clover sector and they go here, or I feel like they're traveling near here, I can use this to build something into the mission or something like that. Okay, so that's one of our POIs. Our second one is, I guess I don't need to do this. It's just a landmark and it's a predator layer. Our second one is going to be, going back up here. Again, they're all in the dusk, so it's 50-50 shot, structure or landmark. I rolled a 4, so we got another landmark coming our way. So another landmark, it is going to be 4, which is an overgrown flora. Okay, cool. So I'm already kind of seeing in my head, and this is kind of what I want, is this area feels kind of abundant with life. It's a grotesque area that's filled with life, right? So there's predators hunting, there's overgrown like forests or like gnarly like paths of some sort of overgrowth, right? And the Corvus are here for some reason. The Corvus don't strike me as the kind of faction that would want to be here, which makes me think that they're here to like get something, right? They're here to, they want something. What that thing is, we would know a little bit more once we had like mechanical foundations for what these landmarks did. But we could already start to paint the picture of what the Corvus are doing here through this stuff. The last thing is going to be a structure or landmark. I'm actually going to just choose structure, and this is a thing. Again, choose a type or roll. I just want to choose a structure just so that I have some variety at this place. So I'm going to just say that it is a structure. And let's see what kind of structure it is. Here are options for structures, by the way. I don't have 6, I have 5, because I feel like Industrial Ruins covers a lot of stuff that I want. I typically have my missions in Nova, but if I come up with a 6th, I'll do that. But we got a shelter of some kind, Industrial Ruins, Settlement Ruins, a stronghold, so some sort of actual base, and an old Sunwell, a valuable resource, no doubt. So let's see what it is. I got a 1, which is a shelter. So it's a shelter of some kind. That's kind of interesting to me, right? Like, and that feels good compared to our other choices where it's like ruins of an industry or something like that. I kind of like the idea of like, this is a very natural sector, not a lot of like built things in the area. And this is just somebody's shelter that has been abandoned, right? And the Sparks might find it. This might be the Corvus's shelter, right? This could be the Corvus that are like in the area. This could be their shelter, right? And as the GM, I'm already starting to piece together like, okay, I can see how these things all combine with one another. So we've got our 3 points of interest for our sector, and that's it. That is that sector painted up. We've got a theme for it, which is it's grotesque, which largely means it's going to be tough in the macro sense and tough in the mission sense. And we have some sense, we have an idea of the points of interest that are inside of it, which are the predator layer, the overgrown flora, and some sort of shelter. And the Corvus are here, and we're not sure why. So there we go. We've got a good start to an idea. Kesrick says, definitely seems like a great way to define a research camp. Yeah, right? Absolutely. Maybe the Corvus are here, and they're trying to research something with the local flora and fauna of this now wasted planet. Maybe there's something that they're hoping to find here that will give them an edge in trying to take out our city, or maybe eventually flee the planet. So we've got a good start to something here. What is our next sector going to be called? What should we call our next sector? I'm just like looking around at stuff on my desk for inspiration. I only have the one dog. If only I'll use my parents' dog, Smitty sector. They're all dogs. Everything's dogs up and down here. All right, let us build a second sector, right? So, and then after we've done this, we'll kind of draw out the map a little bit, and that'll be what we'll accomplish for the night in terms of showing off the New Dawn tech that exists so far. So let's go back to the start here and figure out where we are in terms of the, so we already did this, starting sectors, we know this. Let's figure out the zone that this sector is in. It's a starting sector, so again, what are you looking at? So it's more likely to be Crimson, but we'll see how it goes. I rolled Umbral. Sure, why not? I rolled Umbral. So we have an Umbral zone, which, again, we don't have the mechanics in place right now to explain why that's terrifying, but it's terrifying for like a mission perspective. The theme of our Umbral zone is going to be 1, which is pale. Ooh, I like that. I like pale a lot for an Umbral zone. Far away from the cities, the lunar cult are conducting their weird rituals, right? Like, it makes sense that moon magic and the rituals of the lunar cult, the corruption of the ruin, exists far away from the sun shards and things like that. So I like this. I like pale a lot as our theme. Now, the lunar cult is the faction associated with this theme, so we don't need to roll for it. We can, again, go back down to the themes themselves, and it would show that pale is a lunar cult sector automatically. Again, it doesn't always have to be a lunar cult sector. We could wipe out the lunar cult, or somebody else in the faction chart could wipe them out and take it over. It would still be a pale sector, but now it's filled with haze dwellers, right? Moon corrupted beasts of the dusk. It's kind of cool. I like that idea. Also, generally speaking, we have the mission effects that are just really hard for our players. Supernova's less effective, permanent death on the line, capping health and fuel. Like, it sounds like I've made a pretty hard campaign, which I actually think is kind of cool, because typically I play Nova as like a massive power fantasy sort of thing. So to see it and try and build it in a slightly different way is fun. Okay, so we have our theme. Let's see our number of points of interest. So we had our spread right there. We got 6 again. All right, so there's 3 of them. That's good. I'm having fun building 3. I'm actually generally thinking that I feel like 3 is just a better number. Like, I feel like having 1 or 2 would be not as satisfying. I think maybe I might go like 2, 3, 4 for points of interest. Just to really, especially with starting zones. Maybe there will be a rule about, like, just in general, add 1 to all of these for starting zones or something like that, so that, generally speaking, the sectors feel more full at the start of the campaign. Because it would be such a bummer if you rolled 1 for starting, like, only 1 sector, and it only has 1 point of interest. You're like, oh, okay, I guess we're going here, right? So just kind of bumping it up, I feel, already feels like a good idea. Which is why we're streaming this, to learn. All right, so we have 3 of these. Let's figure out what our structures and landmarks are. Now, the odds are that they're going to be largely landmarks, but we will see. I'm going to just roll all 3 dice at the same time just to kind of slightly expedite the process here. I got a 2, a 4, and a 5, which means we're going to have a very similar setup to where we had before. 1 structure and 2 landmarks. So we have our structure, we have a landmark, and we have another landmark. Cool. Excellent. Let's learn about our structure. Also, I think anomalies are going to be something that are in the umbral. I feel like that's something where like we have like weird things going on. So like I have an example anomaly is temporary, where like this point of interest might disappear after a certain number of missions or turns that the faction turn go by. I like that idea of having like anomalies going on where maybe there's a good chance that it happens in the umbral, a small chance in the dusk, and it just doesn't happen in the crimson because you're too close to the sun shards. All right, let's figure out what kind of shelter we've got. We have a 3, which is industrial ruins, right? It doesn't define exactly what the industrial ruins are. It could be an old factory, right? It could be some sort of warehouse. It could be an old military base, a research lab, right? Some sort of ruins that is associated with production or industry in some way. So, deep out in the umbral, there is a set of ruins out there that we would want to explore. Just to kind of give you a sense again, like industrial ruins, probably going to have like tech, data, and materials as some of the resources, right? So it's got like everything in it. So it's a valuable sort of place because it's going to have lots of stuff in it that people are going to want. Okay, so we have our structure. Let's see what our 2 landmarks are. Roll them both. We get, I rolled 2 5s, so I'm going to re-roll one of them. But we have another predator layer, a rock formation, and a predator layer. Rock formation. Reek formation. So we have some sort of like weird gnarly rocks thing going on, which I can like already see in my head, like thinking about the lunar cult as this cult that is going out there doing these weird rituals. I can see them like carving into the stone in the umbral far away from the sun, like the light of the sun shards. Like these weird shaped rocks and stuff like that that are going to be like powered by the cult in some way. And then a predator layer. I can only imagine how gnarly a predator in the umbral is, right? Like this is where we start to see mean monsters. Ooh, Kesrick, I like that idea too, right? Rock formation and industry instantly makes you think of mining facilities. That's another totally cool way you could take this too, right? Like, okay, cool. So we've got a mine, right? We got some place that was like mining or refining the stuff that we got out of an old mine. Actually, I like that idea a lot too, right? Because now we got the lunar cult maybe has taken over this facility and they're mining. There's something in there like moonstone or something, right? Like maybe when the sun exploded, it smashed some of its shards into the moon, and some of that moonstone came crashing down and it warped our world, and the lunar cult is looking for it. And they think they found it in this mine. And I can also now, if we're going into a mine, I'm seeing a predator in the mines too, right? They dug too deep and too greedily. Something's down there. And just with a few rolls, we've got a good sense of what this zone is like, this sector is like. And that's it. Now we've got this stuff put together. So what does this look like from like a mapping perspective? So again, this is like a map that has been explored a little bit, right? This has, how many? 7 sectors on it. Now, this one wasn't actually developed or played, but also you can see that there's different ideas of like movement based off of the color of the line. So let's add our 2 sectors to the map here. So I'm going to just say, generally speaking, this is like dusk distance right here. So we've got our clover sector, and then I'm going to put like all the way out here is going to be the Smitty sector. I'll put this below so that we can do that later. And let's draw in our lines here just so that we have them from our base to these places so that we can travel to them at some point in the future, right? So like in a future playtest, when we're showing off what travel or exploration or something like that would look like, we have these as like a starting point, and also we'll start to populate this stuff with faction turn things. What I imagine then also as a GM is you're keeping track of like a doc that has something like this, right? Like we have it in our Google Doc, but here it is, right? We can update this Clover segment or sector to include the points of interest that we've added to it, the Corvus that are here, and then specifically what we'll start getting into in future streams is what units of the enemy faction are there. And that's the last thing that I want to kind of talk about here is like populating these sectors even a little bit further. Now we're not going to do this specifically because this stuff isn't fully written yet, but like we have the zone, the theme, and the faction and some things that are there, but like who is there, right? Who is there, and like what are some actual tangible things that are there? That's the last steps. So we go past all of this stuff and we get into like the optional steps. And this stuff is optional only because this stuff is only important if you are going to do like a faction turn thing with your campaign. If you're not interested in doing faction turn stuff or anything like that, then you don't really need to do anything more than what you've done. What you've got now are some good seeds to build missions from, and you're good. But if you want to do some of the faction turn stuff that has enemy factions and units moving around, and the players are moving units around, and there's resources that people are vying for, then these are the optional steps that you would follow. We're not going to go through them fully and do them just because I haven't fully written them yet. But what you would first do is you'd populate it. So you'd determine resources and the enemy units that are there. So the resources that are there are based off of the points of interest. So, if you had remembered back earlier, we talked about these different points of interest and the types of resources that they would have or that they produce. This is all very early. I'm actually kind of in the reworking this in my mind, so this might not be fully what you see the next time that I'm working on this or presenting something. But generally speaking, there'll be some resources there, right? So our Umbral place has an industrial ruins, which is definitely going to have some like tech and data, which is really helpful, and probably materials because and that makes sense, it's a mine. The landmark stuff, probably less tech and data, more material gains, and maybe even sun shards, which are a valuable resource for building up your home base. Like you can see one here at the old Sunwell. So we would note the resources in our document, and then we would determine what enemy missions or enemy units are in that space as well. So we know which enemy faction is there, but what are the units that are there specifically? And there will be rules for all the enemy factions that talk about the types of units that they deploy at a faction-wide scale, like starting units and stuff like that. And then there will be costs and rules for how they produce new units to move around the map and try to hold spaces and take out other units and stuff like that. So if you remember back from what we just showed here, this is, for example, a Corvus. The Corvus are here, and there's a Hawk unit, right? So that's a very specific Corvus faction unit that would exist at the faction turn scale. So this is like a large unit. And it would have a sector effect and a mission effect. So not only would it affect faction turn stuff, but when you do missions in a sector where there are Hawk units, a certain sort of thing happens. So you can see how this all just kind of layers and layers and layers to add things to your missions, right? So now you have you're going to have like a robust structure to build missions and flavor your missions. And you don't have to use all of it, but you can use as much of it as you want as a GM to help build out your world and build out your missions. Which is the last thing that I want to talk about, which is preparing missions. Now, that's not something that you actually have to do, and it's actually something that I specifically note may or may not be a good idea. But you could, in theory, for each of these sectors, design a mission, right? Or multiple missions for it and say, look, here's the missions that are available. You can kind of present it like a bounty board style thing to your players. They're back at the city. You're like, okay, Sparks, here's like the 3 missions that you know of. There's 1 out in the Umbral and there's 2 in this sector in the Dusk. Which one do you want to do? And you, as the GM, having used all these tools, generally know how these missions are going to go, regardless of which one they pick. Like, you have the structure in place. Which is cool. I do this all the time when I run, like, fantasy campaigns. I like making bounty boards. The thing is, though, with this world in Nova and the way that this is designed, is this stuff's going to change a lot. POIs might not exist anymore. Enemy factions might not be present. New units are going to be moving around. So this is just something that I note is, if you do that, if you're the kind of person who likes to pre-design your missions, you might have to do a lot of updating of your missions and tell your players, or you tell them, this is what we get. This is the mission intel that we had. It might be different by the time you get out there. And that would then incentivize them during the faction turn side of things to use that exploration mechanic that will be available to them and like check on sectors before they go in and be like, is this still the situation? Right? Has the mission parameters changed at all? Oh, wait, we thought it was the Corvus, but the Corvus are here. But now there's a huge battalion of Hellions in this sector as well. And so now we just have to consider that factor. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Here's stuff that I'm going to be talking about and working on in future streams. I'm going to be working on mapping new territory. So how do you add new sectors to the map, connect the ones that you already have? How do you travel around the map? The whole section on the faction turn, the idea of the micro and macro cycle of things. So how does a mission in Nova affect this map? And how does this map affect a mission in Nova? And what does that cycle look like? And then talking a lot about this idea of generating missions using the features on the map to have a more robust structure of mission generation. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about tonight. I kind of wanted to just walk through the stuff that I've been working on New Dawn so far, and do our first of what will hopefully be many playtests of the material as I write it. There will be a kind of a break between this stream, and the next one because I'm about to go on my honeymoon, so I'm going to disappear for a little while. But when I get back, this is kind of like the big project that I'm going to be working on, at least early in 2023. So I'm excited to be showing off more of this. Keep an eye out for more updates on all of this. I'll be shouting about it on Twitter and continuously streaming and posting stuff about it as well. So hopefully you found this interesting. I had a lot of fun with it. I'm excited to explore further the Clover and Smitty sectors and see what we find. And we'll see you soon to talk next steps with New Dawn. See you, everybody.